this series. The last one, I think they're recording now. The last one was on 26th of September on the same topic, climate change and human mobility. And this is a second to a continuation of what we did last month. This is in view of the fact that this is a very important area because to me, I see climate change actually another development paradigm. Maybe we can discuss. I'm just throwing that. There have been various paradigms that we develop. If we have human development, we develop. If we have economic growth, I think that now it is all encompassing climate change or environment change in the environment. So I think I will give a very brief background to, let me talk about a little bit on our experts. Just a very short background. Dr. Kees is currently he's the head of the Environment and Migration Interactions and Choices Division at United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. He has been head since 2019, but has worked at UNU in various capacities for the last many years. And his work has been on very interesting. His research has been on the impact of climate change on different types of human mobility, including migration, displacement, planned relocation, and involuntary immobility. These are the different types of human mobility. And his research is also, and this research he did in the Asia Pacific region and other countries in the global south. And he has also done research on loss and damage from climate change and has done a lot of fieldwork in both areas. And so we are here. And of course, he has a number of publications to his credit. And the key feature of his work is that it is human-centered and human-centered perspective with a focus on livelihoods and the mixed method approach, combining quantitative and qualitative research tools, which we will learn from him when we have the question, some of the questions posed to him. Okay, so there's a detailed CV or detailed bio, which I think you can download somewhere. But let me speak a little bit the context, why we are having this. Besides that, this is part of our expert series, dialogue series event. I'll say a little bit, if you guys don't mind, just 5 minutes to set the context. So we have some idea, not everybody change, but just for the benefit of those, including myself. Climate change, which is global warming, is not an issue of concern for the future. This is happening right in the present, and we witness this every day. Through the media, we are getting this information on countries being affected by sudden events such as storms, hurricanes, floods, cyclones, wildfires, and the like, as well as the slow onset events such as drought, desertification, environmental degradation, salinity, soil erosion, and so on and so forth. And all of that affecting the environment, including the soil, and people who work, whose main livelihood is from lands, agricultural land or pastures, or sea levels, fishing and so on. So their livelihood is being affected as a result of the degradation in the environment. And as recently we noticed, well, I have, and it has been noticed everywhere, that the planet has been warming up at greater intensity. And the effects of global warming are evident from the frequency and intensity of natural disasters, which I mentioned. And sadly, these disasters are almost everywhere in the world. It's not restricted to Ethiopia and Somalia, droughts and so on. Now you find that in California, Canada, there are wildfires. There are earthquakes in Syria, Turkey, Morocco. We just had recently a sort of mishap in the Pacific, in Maui, which destroyed the treasured land and the artifacts, indigenous artifacts, cultural artifacts there through fire. The situation is the global warming is intensifying, and this at one of the meetings, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres remarked that our planet had moved from global warming to being on fire, and impressed that the global community needs to control emission of greenhouses to save the planet. So the natural response to these changes would be for people to make a move from where they live in the affected areas. So they, with these unfortunate events, they move from their usual place of residence to look for safer places where they can find sustainable livelihood, security, and protection from future environmental crises. While hard data is hard to find to say what causes, what sort of data or numbers we can attribute to environmental degradation in terms of movement of people. There are some data provided by the International Displacement Monitoring Center. There's some 60.9 million new internal displacements were registered in 2022, and of these, 53% were triggered by disasters, which is great. But that we cannot jump to the conclusion that the environment degradation caused that. There might be other factors, and that is why we have gathered together to get some expert knowledge and wisdom from our resource person. And as I said, this is everywhere, not only in one country or one region, Pakistan to the Philippines to India to the Pacific. The often quoted report, the Groundswell report of the World Bank 2021 shows that by 2050, as many as 260 million people in all 6 regions of the world may be forced to leave their homes and move within their countries of origin and not necessarily outside their boundaries, except that since climate change is not static, we are not ruling out that they will not move outside their borders. So there are a number of challenges as regards differentiating when the environment is the main factor triggering migration or in combination with other factors. So as the environment factor is closely linked to other factors, data collection on environment-related human movements is difficult, except for the fast onset, because those data are reported. How many were affected by floods, earthquake, we have data. But how many get affected when there is slow onset of events? How many people have to leave their homes because they can't grow food anymore, or they can't tend their animals anymore? So that's why we have this event, to get some insight into these issues. So very quickly, the specific objectives of this event is to deepen our understanding of the link between climate change and human mobility or immobility, because not everybody will be able to move, and the need for a more constructive mobility climate change response to maximize protection of affected individuals and communities. 2, to understand diverse patterns and forms of human mobility in the context of climate change. And I don't think we can have anyone more qualified to address these than we have, Dr. Geest. Very quickly, and thank you. The format of the session will be, the guest speaker will share his reflections on and his expert knowledge on certain questions that I will be posing to him, and I will be moderating. We can have the discussion at the end of those questions, but if you feel that we need to have a break and more interactive discussion, we can take 2 questions and then have some discussion and then the remaining questions. Okay, I think we are on to now 10:15. So I will start now, if that is okay. Is it okay, Kees?
Yes, right. Go ahead.
Okay, so I will have this question as follows. First, migration is a normal phenomenon. However, migration patterns are changing. Could you throw light on the various migration patterns? Sorry, I think there's some background. Kindly unmute those who are not speaking. Kindly unmute your button. And when you want to speak, we will let you.
Right. I think now you're muted yourself. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I start again. Migration is a normal phenomenon. However, migration patterns are changing. Could you throw some light on the various migration patterns and how climate change is influencing these patterns? And while you're at it, Kees, maybe you can throw in how your e-learning program developed at EU informs us about the diversity of mobility patterns. Thank you. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you also for the good introduction. And thanks for everybody who joined today. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, and also an honor that Rai invited me for this. I see a few names I know in the room, but there are just one or like two or three. So it's really nice to also see that, yeah, a lot of people that I don't know. I don't know exactly what your kind of level of knowledge is on this topic. I will just speak, assuming kind of an average understanding of the topic, and also, like Rayo already said, we could have some questions in between. I think sometimes just listening all the time to one person can be a little bit boring. So do feel free also to interrupt if there's something you just don't follow or you know. Okay, having said that, I really appreciate, right, that you already from the beginning say migration is a normal phenomenon. And I mean, it's not such a surprising thing maybe to say that, but especially in the field of climate migration, sometimes it is like shown or portrayed as something that is new, and now with climate change there are these large numbers or sometimes millions of people who suddenly get uprooted because of climate change. Like you said, that is not really the case. What's the case is that throughout the almost history of mankind, at least when we start to have data about people's movements, there's a kind of surprisingly constant number of people moving. So if you go back 200 years ago, around 3% of the world population was living in a different country than where they were born. And if you follow these data through history up to the year 2023, you see that there are, spikes from time to time around the First World War, around the Second World War, around major conflicts. But overall, it's a very steady percentage. So the total number of people, because the world population increases, the total number of international migrants also increases, but the percentage stays the same, around 3.5%. So indeed, just to say that with climate change, we do not necessarily expect that suddenly the number of people who are going to migrate is going to increase very substantially. And I'll get back to that in a few minutes. First, when I started working on this topic of the link between first environmental change and migration, we talked more about migration than about human mobility. So over the past 10, 15 years, there's been that little shift. So especially when you talk about people moving, like in the context of climate change, it really makes sense to distinguish different types of mobility. And Raju already mentioned them: migration, displacement, planned relocation, and immobility. So here, migration in this list of 4 is actually the type of mobility that is kind of more voluntary, more proactive. And usually, so this is in situations where people move in a more kind of a proactive and voluntary way. So yes, there is a pressure coming from the environment, coming from climate stressors. Maybe the area is getting drier, the risk of certain events is increasing. So people think like, I'm not sure whether this place is still a good place for me and my family to be. So I'm thinking of moving, and then there's time to think of where to go, when to go, with whom to go. And so that's migration, where also the kind of the outcomes are usually more positive, because people have had time to prepare their move and make the right decision where to go, when to go, etc. Then we have displacement, which is usually more forced. So there's this, what we call a continuum between voluntary and forced. You can't say that any movement is totally voluntary or totally forced, because there are usually always some kind of option, even if it looks really forced. And even when it looks really voluntary, there's always some kind of force. Anyway, for displacement, we see that, yes, there's more force. Often it's also more like sudden. And in relation to climate, you would often see that well, most of the displacements that occur worldwide are related to floods, for example. So you can imagine when a drought comes, there's more lead time. There's more, you see gradually, oh, this year the harvest is not going to be good. So people have time to make a well-informed decision or how to cope with this situation, and migration can be one of the options there. But with displacement, it's often sudden, less organized, and often comes with much more negative consequences to people and also to the host communities they're from, and often also the host communities where they go to and the home communities where they come from. Then the third mobility type, planned relocation, is a topic that we are now actually working on quite a bit. There's very little researchers around the world who are currently working on this topic. And that is totally different for the topic of climate-related migration. When I started, there were maybe a few dozens, I think, researchers working on this topic. And now there are, I would estimate like almost 1,000 or more researchers worldwide on this topic. But for planned relocation, that is really new. And so how is planned relocation different from the other mobility types? Firstly, it is usually not individuals moving alone, but planned relocation is like relocation of like groups of people, entire communities. And usually it is also initiated or supported by governments or other external actors. And then we have that fourth type, immobility, and this topic emerged in the climate mobility literature around 12 years ago with the publication of the Foresight report, who for the first time documented well this topic of trapped populations. So people who are living in areas that are prone to environmental risk, who would want to move out, but don't have the means or the contacts, or they are not able to move even though they would want to. So they are trapped in situations of environmental risk. Now we see, this is very new, just from the last couple of years, research emerging on the topic of voluntary immobility. And what is that exactly? that is like situations and where people are told like, hey, you're living in a dangerous place, your area, your home it's too risky to stay here, you have to go. And when people resist that, they can resist this kind of planned relocation, we talk of voluntary immobility. So that's already me talking quite a bit, just explaining the 4 mobility types in more detail. But Rai, your question was also, what are the overall like migration patterns? And I mean, I cannot, of course, there wouldn't be time to describe all the migration patterns around the world. But what I think is important to distinguish is kind of these different how do you call that, angles to what type of migration or typologies of migration, where I mentioned one continuum between forced and voluntary, but there's also like the short distance, long distance, where, for example, some people move their village from the coast to 200-meter inland. Right? But others cross almost the entire globe to settle somewhere else. So distance is one, then time is one. Some people use mobility, short-term mobility, like seasonal or cyclical migration, as a coping strategy to deal with seasonal food shortages, for example. So these people would move maybe 3 to 6 months a year and then stay the rest of the year at home. So there's a time dimension, the space dimension, the forced voluntary dimension, but there's also things like high skilled kind of knowledge workers, expats, versus more like labor migration. And so I think it is always useful for when you do research to not pretend that we can know in very general terms what is the influence of climate change on migration or displacement. No, you have to probably, or we have to be kind of more modest, like in which circumstances does which climate stressor, like a drought is different from a flood and a hurricane, etc., influence which type of mobility. So we see in some circumstances that that after a drought, the overall number of people who migrate stays the same. Then some people, if you don't do thorough research, they will say, oh, before the drought, during the drought, after the drought, the number of migrants were the same. So droughts do not influence migration. But then if you disaggregate the data and you find out, for example, that after the drought, the number of women who moved dropped substantially and the number of men increased substantially, you would see that, yeah, the total number is the same. But then you have to go into more depth to figure out, like, okay, how does this work? Why does a drought have different effects on the mobility patterns of men and women, or of household heads versus other family members, or different occupational groups, etc. So I think I'm going to pause here for a moment. Ray, you also asked me to say something about the e-learning course, but I think I'm going to keep that to the end of the meeting, if that is okay with you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for illuminating these 4 types of movements. Within those, as you said, there could be a continuum. You can go 50 yards or 50 meters, because it's safer there, and then wait for a while, and then have next movement a bit longer. It's the same person, after that, going a bit longer, and then moving the city, moving the village or whatever, going to. So it's very, very difficult to trace numerically, to say in terms of data, but there's multiple movements or whether it's multiple people moving. You know what I mean? It's the same person or same people who are moving from one to the other, but these are multiple movements. Well, how does that affect in terms of the protection, in terms of policy planning, and in terms of providing the kind of protection they require for policymakers? So I think it's not only data on climate-related displacement or movements, difficult to pinpoint. The mobility itself is problematic. So I'm wondering how we respond to when it comes to protecting people who are on the go, who are on the move. Yeah. So thanks very much. I don't know if you want to say anything, or maybe we proceed to the. So does it make the task of researchers complicated if we continue to complicate more, put in more questions while trying to solve one question, and we put in more? Where does this, do we go round and round, or do we come to some conclusion in the end? Because there has to be cut off. As a researcher, you have been working on the ground, I'm sure, collecting data, qualitative data and so on. How has it improved our understanding of these patterns in terms of the rights and protection of people?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ray. Yeah. Like I said earlier that when I started this work in early 2000s, about 20 years ago, there were not so many people researching this. And over the past 20 years, there have been, we recently saw latest numbers, like peer-reviewed journal articles, 1,400 on this topic, with like a strong increase over the years. So in the early years of this field of research, you would typically have 6 or 7, 10 papers per year, and now you would have around 100 plus per year. So sometimes we can be critical about all this like academic output. What does it tell us? Does it really help in any way? Well, I can say for the field of climate mobility research, yes, all this research that has been done in all corners of the earth have really strongly increased our understanding of the topic. And like I said, it doesn't mean that we can say like a law of gravity for migration or so, a law. So it is a complex issue. So what we see is like the question that we in the beginning probably asked ourselves was like, does environmental change or do climate stressors in any way influence migration? A number of the questions have actually changed. It's more now like, okay, under which circumstances do which types of climatic stresses lead to which types of mobility for which types of people? And maybe it's not so easy to communicate these findings, but actually for a policymaker or for international organization or for national governments who hopefully have it on their agenda to protect people against impacts of climate change, and who would want like more positive mobility types that contribute to long-term sustainability of livelihoods. So for such policymakers, it is probably more useful to have that more specific findings of like under which circumstances, which type of mobility, because you cannot formulate policy on a very general finding like, climate change in 2.5% of all mobility played a role, something like that. That such information is not very useful for policymakers. So what we have seen is that over the years, there first around the year 2010 to 2015, there was a boom in all kinds of case studies in different parts of the world. And then unsurprisingly, the finding was like, each situation is different. Context is everything. So in one context, migration of climate shocks can lead to less migration, for example. and in another one to more migration. And so now we need to understand, and we have started to understand better the kind of mechanisms behind it. So for some people, it may come as a surprise to hear that after a drought, less people migrate. I don't know whether, does it come as a surprise to you? Maybe for a lot of people, it was a surprise at the beginning, but when you go deeper and you just understand, like, okay, here's a drought, here's a rural community, a rural region where most of the people depend on agriculture, and they experience a drought, the crops fail, and they can't earn, they can't sell a large part of their harvest to have income. So our normal reaction or thought is like, oh, because their harvest fail, probably they're going to migrate because they have to find a way to survive, to earn money, etc. But the reality is that in many circumstances, people who experience a drought and a crop failure actually no longer migrate because it takes resources to migrate. And because of the drought, they're not able to migrate because they lack the money to buy the ticket or to spend to afford like a few weeks in their destination area, looking for a place to live, looking for a job. You need money to move. So that maybe, I think you also wanted to know a little bit more about this the type of research that we do, right, with this mixed method research that you mentioned in the introduction. And I think the work that I've been doing with the team at UNU EHS, we use this mixed method research where instead of just using one type of methodology, like a survey, we combine different methodologies, usually combining more qualitative with more quantitative methods, but also methods at different levels of scale. So more micro in terms of like local case studies, but we embed these local case studies in more regional kind of structures and patterns that we see based on a whole other type of data. So I can give you an example from northern Ghana, where I worked quite a lot. So there, we would use like satellite data, remote sensing of the environment. So we would have for the whole of northern Ghana, we would have rainfall and vegetation and crop yields, all these data at like 1 kilometer cells. And then, so we could see over time, 30 years, whether an area had become drier or less dry, what were the times of droughts, what were the times of more larger amounts of rainfall. And then we combine that with population census data to see if in times of drought or in areas that are drier than other areas, we see more outmigration or not. So that is like the more spatial analysis, more quantitative. And if you combine that with the more like local case studies at micro level, and then in these local case studies, you combine qualitative research like open interviews, life histories, with questionnaires, you get actually the whole picture. So the life histories give you that longitudinal perspective. The questionnaire gives you, a little bit more, let's say, less anecdotal evidence, because those life histories, they give you very interesting data about people's personal experiences with drought and how they maybe use migration as a way to cope or adapt. And but you would have that only for a few people. So you use the survey to actually say, to test whether certain things you saw in the open interviews were how generalizable they can be over the bigger population. And then you can link that to the more quantitative and data for a larger area. And the thing is, like, when you do that, you'll see that each method sometimes gives you different results, and that can be very like uncomfortable for a researcher, because you have to really, dig and dig and dig, and then triangulate and figure out, like, why is it like this in with this method, and like that in that method. But that's in the end the only way to really get a good picture. And now here comes a more critical remark. It is, so much easier for a researcher who needs to publish a number of articles each year. It is so much easier to just pick one method, run the analysis, make sure it's methodologically sound, and then just get it published. Journals, they don't ask for you to combine 3 or 4 methods, and it's really also difficult to report on all these different methods when you just have like 6,000 or 7,000 words that you can use to do your findings. So, but I think this kind of research, mixed method research, is really necessary to get a good picture of climate and mobility.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think this is very, very interesting, because it gives you an insight as to what people's thinking is, and rather than generalizing. And when doing the analysis or recommendations, then you build that in. So I think this is really very interesting and insightful. So I think you have probably, you have handled the second question that I was going to ask on mixed method research. So I think this is very, very, as researchers we do, but I think in the case of climate change, it's not that easy, because you're taking into account the perceptions of people. They might be saying, okay, today it's not risky, but maybe in 2 years' time, then I think I need to move today rather than in 2 years' time. So I think it's really, really very enlightening. Maybe I can take a pause and ask if there's anyone who wants to contribute to the discussion. You're very welcome. And if you do, kindly state who you are and, if possible, your institution, and unmute yourself. Professor Kadria, very welcome. I didn't know you were in the audience.
Well, I was attending the other one. I was, the remittance thing on Africa. And so I probably would have missed the initial few comments that you were making, but I was fortunate enough not to miss Professor Geest's presentation. So I had the opportunity of listening to him, and it's certainly very holistic and for the understanding of the entire picture in terms of different types of migration, climate migration, and so on. Now, the question that these issues raise in my mind, and maybe in the minds of other people also, are in terms of policies. What kind of policies and who are the people who are taking these measures? Let me not call it all policies, but measures. People themselves undertake efforts, make efforts to, prevent or adapt to the situation. On the other hand, the society and the government has its own roles or responsibilities. And that's where I think you had started this work 20 years ago, and you might have noticed at that point in time also there were some policies in some countries whereby whether it was geared towards climate change mitigation or something else, but in terms of relocating people or encouraging them to settle down at places which were less inhabited, and giving incentives for that purpose in terms of entry to the country or settlement and subsidies and so on. So if you reflect on that, I think it would be, a good learning for us.
Sorry, and by the way, Professor Kadra is President of GRFDT. Thank you.
Very nice meeting you, Professor Geest.
Yes. Yeah, many thanks for your question, Prof. Kadria. Yeah, I think it's really important to indeed talk about policy. And UNU, United Nations University, where I work, is not a regular normal university. Our mandate is really to try to do research, also often in direct collaboration with policymakers. So not just do academic research and then add a few policy recommendations, but to be actively involved there. So I'm happy that you asked that question. In terms of policy in the field of climate and mobility, so there's a lot of climate related policy and measures and interventions that influence mobility. And there's also a lot of policy around migration that influence how people who are, under pressure from climatic stressors can use mobility or cannot use mobility. So what I'm trying to say here, that policy in the area of climate plays a role, and policy in the area of migration plays a role. And then there's very little policy that is specifically formulated for climate-related migration. And that is not surprising, because in reality, I didn't probably explicitly enough mention that in after the first question, but there's this topic of multi-causality. So in reality, people move for such a large variety of reasons that overlap. You can actually hardly ever say, like, this person moved for climate reasons or only for climate reasons. It's always a mix. So when you say, okay, we're going to develop policy for climate-induced migration, then it's like, okay, yeah, but then we first have to identify who those people are, and then you come with the multi-causality thing. So, okay, what has been done, what can be done? I'll give you one example. Sticking to the topic of drought, like if when a drought would cause a crop failure, and people would be pushed to migrate, whether they're able to migrate or not. If there is like policy locally, like how can we make sure that when a drought hits, people do not go hungry? Yeah. So how can we make sure that either the harvest doesn't fail despite the lower amount of rainfall, and you can think of climate smart agriculture, more irrigation, which, for example, in Africa is lacking almost everywhere. But also, how can we make sure that when harvests do fail, there are enough, let's say, local coping strategy that would maybe not make it necessary to move. Now, one thing I want to make very clear here is that a lot of the countries' national policies do insufficiently recognize the value of migration, the necessity of migration. Without migration, countries do not function anymore. But politicians and policymakers do not like to admit that, because, and that's kind of a very, you can actually understand that attitude from policymakers, because what do policymakers want? They want to organize their country. They want to, and to be able to organize their country, where to build schools, where to build highways, how to spend your money for healthcare. You need to, it's much easier when you know exactly how many people are in that place, and it's not changing all the time. And migration messes things up in the kind of organized brain of policymakers. But they don't realize that once there's no migration, the whole country stops functioning. I was recently in Senegal, and they are neighbors of Mauritania. In Mauritania, every time there's a little bit of a conflict somewhere, Mauritania says, oh, we're going to send all the Senegalese migrants back to Mauritania, to Senegal. And then after 2 weeks, the whole country doesn't work anymore. No bread because the Senegalese are baking the bread. Other, people complaining that they can't find anybody to clean their house, or there's no fish in the market. So migration is necessary, and I think we have to, whenever we can, let policymakers also know that, and those who do not realize that enough. Okay.
Okay, so if I could come in, I think this is important. Migration and mobility need to be distinguished because when there is a temporary mobility because of the climatic reasons or sudden something, that's different. And if people, and I agree with you that it should not be reactive, it should be proactive, reactive and proactive policies. So if the work is done properly and governments know that this is the area which is prone to earthquakes, and therefore what sort of preparedness they have to have, even though they have agencies for that. Or this place gets droughts very often. What can they do to not prevent the drought, but to help people not to move by providing the kind of either water or helping them with their food and so on? Because the more people move, the less it contributes to their well-being, because mobility is costly. So it puts you back. In other words, the more you're moving short distance, that is involuntary mobility, short term. It's actually, you have to start all over again. You may have to leave your belongings behind, and where you move, you may have to buy another belongings, and that puts you behind. So I think in terms of policies, and this brings me to this, the importance of local level governance or migration or mobility governance, rather than only national level. So I'll leave it to that, and I give chance to others. Please either raise your hands or put your question in the chat. No one here? Oh, there's something in there, and I don't know how to look for. Feroz, are you there? Sorry, if I go into the chat, just a second. Okay, yes. Let me see. There are some questions in the chat. The question is, I can read. Thank you for you can read, informative presentation, Dr. Geest. In your expert opinion, what should states and relevant stakeholders do to obtain reliable data on climate migrants? And what type of governance structures do you recommend for climate mobility with regard to international migration regimes? Thank you. Loaded question.
Yeah, thanks, Ismail. Very, that's a lot. So, yeah, I mean, it's for data. I mean, one thing is like you have every 10 years population census in many countries. One thing people of census offices could do is to, in the census, include 1 or 2 or 3 questions on like when people are not living in the area where they were born, to have some question around reasons why people move. But I mean, like if I have been telling you like how complex it is to actually research climate mobility, and you need this kind of mixed method research, obviously asking this question in the census is not going to solve everything. And so if you ask somebody, why did you move, there are so many reasons for people to move that overlap, that change over time, that work at different levels of like more micro level and more like the whole kind of colonial history of the country. So people are not going to say, oh, it's because of the exploitation of the colonial power and now my area is underdeveloped. and that's why I moved. But in fact, that is probably often a very important reason. But you're not gonna hear that when you just ask somebody, why did you move? So anyway, yeah, and on government's structure and regime, I'm afraid I will not be able to answer that question. So in a few minutes, but there is this global compact on migration. I think you have probably all heard of that. That's a relatively good document, and there is also good attention, maybe not enough, but for attention for climate and environment as possible drivers of mobility. The thing is, of course, it's a beautiful. It's like the constituency of some countries, which is beautifully written, but then how to put that in practice. So maybe I'll just leave it here for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. We have Mr. Harijan Singh. Sorry, Harijinder Singh. Can you hear us? Unmute yourself, please. Yeah, okay. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I am from Punjabi University, Patiala, Punjab, from India. Basically, I am pursuing PhD. The topic is very much concerned about the. Am I audible?
It's a little bit difficult to hear you,
yeah.
but
I've just raised the volume. Let's see if that helps. Can you, sorry. No, we can't hear you now. Are you muted?
Or maybe you can type your question in the box.
Yeah, type your question in the box, because in the interest of time, just type your question, please, and then he will answer. Let's see what the question is. Let me see.
Yeah, maybe. Meanwhile, I will maybe say a few more things, because I mean, before this interview, you also asked me to say a few things around migration and adaptation, how they are related, and I do think it is important to say something about that. So you know, I think it's very important to not think like, okay, migration is good or migration is bad, or mobility is good or mobility is bad. It's really about understanding, like, and in terms of policy, coming back to Prof. Kadira's question, like, you want to have policy that enables more positive outcomes of mobility. And you want policy that reduces the possible negative outcomes of mobility, which is more like displacement. So you want to make sure that those people who want to move, for who it would be good to move, that those people are able to move. And when they move, find a meaningful thing to earn sustainable livelihoods in their destination, and to be safe from climate risks and other vulnerabilities. And you want to avoid as much as possible these negative forms of mobility where people are forced to move in very unideal circumstances. And when people are first forced to move, when people are not able to return back to their home, in the case of planned relocation, those movements come with what we call loss and damage, or non-economic loss and damage. Even if movements are positive in terms of being able to move out of harm's way, it often still comes with loss. You lose a certain, you lose the place where you grew up, you lose maybe the social cohesion of the community where you grew up. So policy is really should really focus on avoiding that kind of negative forms of mobility. I don't think Harjinder wrote his.
There's one question, which is climate change has exacerbated ethnic conflicts in different parts of the world and has in turn led to increased migration. the question is, even though she couldn't listen to that,
Okay, yeah, I got it.
yeah, you got it.
Yeah, and I'm happy that you put it as a question and not as a, as a fact, because it is actually a big debate. Like, and it's not really my field actually, but this idea, like, does climate change actually already lead to conflict, or does it? Others would say when in times of pressure on natural resources, for example, because of climatic stresses like drought, people think like, oh, probably there's more conflict because people are competing over resources. But you actually, field work done in many parts of the world shows that in times of such environmental stress, there's more collaboration to together be able to continue living and farming and herding in a way that works. So sometimes it leads to more collaboration, sometimes it does lead to more conflict, but it's not like a very linear causation, let's say. I'm not sure. We are now just past the hour, and
yeah,
I would love to stay for 2 more hours and talking with everybody, but I have actually another appointment coming up.
Okay, I had one question which I wanted you to very briefly answer. I'm sorry, the time hasn't been managed well. Do you see migration as an adaptation response to climate change, including natural disasters? And from your field research on climate change and human mobility, could you provide some insights on the various adaptation strategies or options that climate affected individuals or households reported they had to resort to? In other words, what do they, because they have, we can't consider these climatically affected people as helpless. Okay, they do have, and they need to be empowered. So from your research studies, what kind of insights can one gain, and how then policymakers or those who support facilitate that? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Ray. Yeah, and I mean the question on whether migration is helps adaptation or is adaptation or not is a very important one. It links a bit to what I mentioned earlier on policy and how we should make sure that mobility is adaptive and not and does not come with too much, losses and damages and negative effects. So what we see from research is that yes, there are a number of ways that migration is a form of adaptation. And there is also good research showing how migration can help other adaptation strategies. So that's a very, the typical example is like people move and with the remittances, like if they live in an area where there's better job opportunities, they can save some money, and usually they try to help their family at home with remittances. They send money home, but also sometimes they just learn new things as while they are migrants in another country or another region or in a city. So they learn things that would then help them to adapt better to the kind of environmental or climate stresses that affect their home communities. So with that knowledge, with that experience, and also with the money they have been able to save or send home. So there are these lots of cases around the world document where it does work like that. There's also critique on this idea of migration as adaptation, and that critique is that it puts migrants in, it gives responsibility to migrants for adaptation, for actually solving a problem that they have not caused, right? And taking over tasks from their government, like their government is responsible for protecting its citizens. and for protecting the citizens against the impacts of climate change also, and the international community or the polluters are, you know, responsible for this situation. So why should migrants take the responsibility or be given the responsibility to help adaptation? So that's the critique on this idea of migration as adaptation.
Yeah, thanks very much. I know we are running out of time, but I had this question on the loss and damage fund, because this ties in with adaptation as well. Because if people are making choices to either stay or not move, then the areas have to be supported. So I was going to ask if this fund, loss and damage fund, is operationalized right now. I don't know what's happening at COP28. I haven't followed it recently. Whether they have talked about the fund could be operationalized and how then the countries can leverage this to support their communities as well as vulnerable areas in relation to climate related displacement. Would you mind just throwing some light on that? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. It looks like I'm going to stay a few more minutes because that's another big question. Now, it's a question that does not have a clear answer. And I don't know, luckily or unfortunately, there's probably some years before we need to actually have clear answers to this question. I say unfortunately because, you know, as we know, last year, COP27, it was decided to establish these funding arrangements and this fund. But before money actually started flowing from that fund, well, we can probably expect to be in the year 2028 if I'm optimistic, 2030 something if I'm pessimistic. So on the use of this fund. So I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the topic of loss and damage, but in the Paris Agreement, there's this language about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. So averting is like, how do you avert loss and damage? Is mostly by just cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what we have to do. Minimizing loss and damage by better disaster risk management and adaptation. But then the third part, addressing loss and damage, that is what supposedly this fund has to focus on. But that's exactly the area of policy and interventions that is least developed. So when it comes to mitigation and adaptation and disaster risk management, there are, thousands of organizations worldwide, and each country has policy in place for that. But this area of addressing losses and damages, so in areas or places where adaptation is becoming increasingly difficult or impossible or like just prohibitively expensive, what can we do in those areas and for the people, the most vulnerable people who live in such areas, to deal with this situation that adaptation is probably no longer possible, although this is tricky because who decides that adaptation is no longer possible, right? It's often a matter of like, do we want to spend and invest so much money to protect this place? But in reality, a lot, and that's also, I guess, where mobility comes in and planned relocation, for example, you would want, maybe as one example for this fund, to look at specifically those places that are really the front lines of climate change, where really adaptation is becoming really difficult, to see, okay, if this area is becoming like too risky, too unsafe to live, but also if this place is no longer suitable for farming, for example, and everybody that lives there depends on agriculture. But if people do not want to move because this is where they came from, what kind of, how can this loss and damage fund be used, for example, income support for people who, outside of their blame, their area, their habitat, the place where they grew up becomes unproductive. So how, and they don't want to move. They say, it's not my fault that this is happening. How can maybe this fund be used to make sure that people can continue to live in such places with the kind of social protection, income support, and other measures to allow people to stay there and find maybe new meaningful ways to earn a living in the future, but with that support. I think I'm going to leave that here because people are pushing me to finalize.
I'm not pushing you anymore. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you for your time and your expert knowledge, and to clarify on certain issues that we were not, well, some of us are not very clear, especially even the loss and damage fund, because it's not just carte blanche. It is for certain areas where other means fail, and therefore they have to be protected because for this their native place. They just can't be pushed to where elsewhere. So I think this is great. We have benefited a lot. I have learned a lot as regards various both quantitative and qualitative methods in determining mobility. And like everything else, data is always, it's variable. Data we cannot be very sure about. Climate migrants, and some countries or some agencies don't want to use the word climate migrant, because then it takes you into some other domain, like the conflict-related migration and so on. So I leave it to that and to say I really appreciate your time and your support, and also the UNU for releasing, in the sense, your precious time to us. And we at GRFDT are very lucky to have your contribution, and we hope to stay in touch. Thank you very much. And to those who had some questions to ask, with the time limitation, we are sorry that we were not able to accommodate those, but we tried. Thank you again. Thank you very much to all of you. And thank you, Dr. Geest, for your time.
Thank you very much, Rai, for having me, and everybody for joining. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.